I'd like to introduce the Tableland Pipe Band, who will perform a tune that has been specifically commissioned by Pipe Bands Australian and written by Melbourne composer Mark Sewell for the 75th anniversary of the ending of the World War II, simply called VP 75, Lest We Forget. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dave Bilney, Councillor with the Tablelands Regional Council, and I will be today's Master of Ceremonies. I would like to draw to your attention this wonderful, respectful memorial, which reflects the importance of the Rocky Creek area and those who passed through it during the Second World War. Mayor Rod Marty will talk more about this new site and sculpture later in the program. Today also marks the 25th anniversary since the Rocky Creek War Memorial Park was opened, back at VP Day 50 in 1995. Japan's unconditional surrender to the Allies was announced 75 years ago on August the 15th, 1945, some 3 months after Nazi Germany's surrender in Europe. After 6 years of war, it marked the end of the Second World War for Australia. The surrender was wildly celebrated in towns right across Australia as the news spread. Almost 1 million Australian men and women served in the Second World War in campaigns in Europe, the Mediterranean, North Africa, Middle East, Southeast Asia and the Pacific. By the end of the war, many had suffered as prisoners of war and nearly 40,000 Australians had lost their lives. During the war, the Tablelands area became the largest military base in Australia. Rocky Creek, where we gather today, is significant as it is the site of the largest military hospital in the Southern Hemisphere, which treated over 60,000 troops between 1942 and 1945. Each year, Victory in the Pacific, or VP Day as it is known, is commemorated here at the Rocky Creek War Memorial Park on the nearest Sunday to the 15th of August. The Rocky Creek War Memorial was established in 1995 to remember those service personnel that passed through the Atherton tablelands during the Second World War. Many did not return. We gather on this day to commemorate those who paid the ultimate sacrifice and those who served, to reflect on the horror and suffering of war, the bravery and loyalty of all Australian servicemen and women, past and present, and to thank those whom we owe the peace we enjoy today. I would like to give a very special acknowledgement to the World War II veterans here with us today. My father-in-law, Jack Duffy, deckhand seaman, Merchant Navy. Frank McGee, Ordinary Seaman, Royal Australian Navy. Philip English, OAM, Sergeant Pilot, Royal Australian Air Force, and Dr. Stan Mellick, OAM ED, Lieutenant Colonel, Australian Armed Forces. Please lend a hand, a round of applause to these men. Thank you all for joining us today to commemorate this important anniversary. I'll now go through the acknowledgements. I would particularly like to acknowledge the Honourable Susan McDonald, Senator for Queensland. The Honourable Curtis Pitt, MP, Speaker of the Legislative Assembly of Queensland and Member of Mulgrave, and representing Ms Jennifer Howard, MP, the Assistant Minister for Veterans Affairs and Assistant Minister for the State. Councillor Rod Marty, Mayor of Tablelands Regional Council. Councillor Angela Toppin, Mayor, Mareeba Shire Council. Fellow councillors from Tablelands Regional Council and Mareeba Shire Council. Councillor Mark Nolan, Mayor of Castlereagh Coast Regional Council, and Councillor Jeff Baines. Lieutenant Colonel Mick O'Sullivan, Commanding Officer, 51st Battalion, Far North Queensland Regiment. Warrant Officer Class 1, Andrew Munn, Regimental Sergeant, Major, 51st Battalion, Far North Queensland Regiment. Commander Glenn Williams, Commanding Officer of HMAS Cairns, Royal Australian Navy. Warrant Officer David Cook, Command Warrant Officer, HMAS Cairns. Our guest speaker, Margaret Plant. All serving members, both past and present, and the families who are unveiling the new plaques today. We have some apologies from the following. The Honourable Sterling Hinchcliffe, MP, Minister for Local Government. Ms Jennifer Howard, MP, the Assistant Minister for Veterans Affairs and Assistant Minister for the State. The Honourable Shane Knuth, MP, Member for Hill. Senator Nita Green, Labor Senator for Queensland. Mayor Bob Manning, OAM, Cairns Regional Council. Mayor Michael Kerr, Douglas Shire Council. Mr Ted Mildren, CSM, State President, Queensland Division, Royal Australian Air Force Association. Mr Alex Garland, State President of National Servicemen's Association of Australia, Queensland Incorporated. Mr Mark Dillon, President, 51st Battalion Association. Mr Owen Roney, Vice President, National Service and Combined Forces Association of Australia Incorporated. Mr Peter Nielsen, World War II North Queensland researcher, and the many others who wish to join us today but were unable to do so. I would now like to welcome Wodjinbara Tableland Yidinji Emerging Elder, Mr Darryl Joseph, to conduct the Welcome to Country.
Thank you, Dave, for that introduction. Good morning, all. Well, the weather is perfect this morning for this special event to reflect and celebrate the 75th anniversary for the victory in the Pacific and the other ceremonies of unveiling and dedication of plaques. Yes, as Dave said, Darryl Joseph is my name. I was born and raised on the Tablelands, And as a Warrnambool Tableland Yidiji descendant through my late mother's lineage, and being from the First Nations people of this area, where we meet here today, at this special place, the Rocky Creek War Memorial Park. And I have been bestowed this privilege from my elders to do the Welcome to Country address. And I have my elders and my aunties here today to join me, and my cousins. I wish to acknowledge here in attendance this morning, as mentioned, as they were introduced, the dignitaries, current and ex-services personnel and their families, and other services, special guests, ladies, gentlemen, boys and girls. I would like to thank those coordinating parties involved in presenting this significant annual ceremony for the invitation and the opportunity for me to participate in this VP Day. Tableland Yidiji country and the landscape environment, like a number of other areas in the region and around far north Queensland, was utilised for the staging of crucial and essential training, preparation and the provision of medical needs of the many military units and their personnel for the World War II campaign. My late mother told numerous stories of her recollections and experiences, and sometimes interactions as a young girl witnessing the army conducting their training around the tablelands. Tableland Yidiji, for me, not only has a valued cultural and traditional importance, but also I have great admiration for my relatives who served with thousands of fellow Australian military troops that prepared on this land for the battle in the Pacific, where many of them were wounded and numerous that made the ultimate sacrifice in defending this wonderful country, Australia. On behalf of the Tableland Yidiji people, and with great respect to our ancestors, past elders, and our current elders, and those emerging, such as I therefore take this honour and welcome you all to country, here at this place, the land where we meet to commemorate the 75th anniversary of victory in the Pacific Day. May I part by saying have a great, enjoyable day. Thank you. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you, Daryl. I would now like to invite Tableland's Regional Council Mayor Rod Marty and Lieutenant Colonel Mick O'Sullivan, Commanding Officer of the 51st Battalion, Far North Queensland Regiment, to unveil the new sculpture called Theatres by local artist Amanda Fayer.
Good morning. It's great to see everyone here on this beautiful winter day for what is an important commemorative service and an entrenched part of our history. After last year's service, World War II veteran Dr. Stan Malik suggested a memorial project. We are pleased to have realised Dr. Malik's vision and to have completed it in time for this year's significant anniversary. Award-winning local artist Amanda Fayer has sculpted theatres to recognise the facilities, actions and people from this site, which was the largest World War II military hospital in the Southern Hemisphere. The sculpture features the Igloo Entertainment Theatre the care and healing given by the hospital and medical theatres, and the overall theatre of war in the Pacific. As always, the rising sun continues to represent all eras of Australian service personnel and aligns with the arch sign and curved roofline of the igloo itself. Thank you to landscape architect Andrew Prowse, project manager Ralph Gurman, the Rocky Creek War Memorial Park Advisory Committee, including councillors Bilney and Wills, artist Amanda Faher and her team, and TRC Coordinator of Tourism, Culture and Events, Gwyneth Navard, for combining their skills and dedication to bring this project together. We hope this site, its story and its spirit will be enjoyed and respected by our community and visitors for many years to come. Lieutenant Colonel Mick O'Sullivan and I now have the honour of unveiling the new sculpture. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Rod Marty and Lieutenant Colonel Mick O'Sullivan. Thank you. I'd now like to invite our first guest speaker, Margaret Plant, to tell us about the nurses of the Rocky Creek Hospital.
Honoured guests, ladies and gentlemen, before I tell you some history of the nurses who served at Rocky Creek Hospital, I would like to state that I am not a member of the Australian Army Nursing Corps. I am a historian dressed in a World War I costume to honour the nurses and sisters who did wear this uniform, and that in World War II. I pledge myself loyally to serve my King and country and to maintain the honour and efficiency of the Australian Army Nursing Service. I will do all in my power to alleviate the suffering of the sick and wounded, sparing no effort to bring them comfort of body and peace and mind. This is the pledge made by the members of the Australian Army Nursing Service, known as the AANS in World War II. Today, I am honoured to say a few words on behalf of the Rocky Creek nurses and the female staff here. During World War II, women from around Australia joined various agencies and military services. The Atherton Tablelands were well represented in all services, with nearly 400 local ladies joining up down south. One local whose military history isn't well known was Wandekla-born nursing sister Valerie Smith, who was on board the steamship Vina Brook when it was sunk by the Japanese in 1942. Valerie was one of the 24 nurses who returned home from the prisoner of war camp with Sister Vivian Bullwinkle, a name we're familiar with. Whilst she didn't work at Rocky Creek, her name is worthy of mention today as one of the 5,000 nurses in the Australian Army Nursing Service, plus the sisters and nursing attendants of the Royal Australian Naval Nursing Service and the Women's Australian Auxiliary Air Force, the WAAF, who served in World War II. Women of the Australian Army Nursing Service, the Australian Women's Army Service, and the Women's Australian Auxiliary Air Force and the Australian Red Cross were based both here at Rocky Creek and around the Atherton Tablelands. There were around 500 Women's Land Army girls based in Atherton. It's difficult to get accurate figures for all the units and services because the records weren't kept as well as they are today. Many of the nursing sisters based here at Rocky Creek were battle-seasoned veterans who served in Greece, Egypt and other war zones and accompanied our wounded men home from foreign shores. They returned home as battle-weary as our men. They never shirked a duty, no matter how distasteful the task or how disfigured their patient was. Rocky Creek Hospital consisted of the 19th Field Ambulance, 5th Australian Camp Hospital, 2nd Australian General Hospital, 2nd 6th Australian General Hospital, 2nd 1st Australian Convalescent Depot, 1st Australian Camp Hospital, 4th Ambulance Train, 47th Australian Camp Hospital, and the Australian Red Cross Society. The Rocky Creek nurses, mainly from the Australian Army Nursing Service, were supported by many other professionals from the Australian Army Women's Medical Service and the Australian Red Cross, including clerks, dental assistants, physiotherapists and nursing assistants, and those working in specialist departments such as the operating theatre, the blood bank and orthopaedics. Physiotherapists were unaligned at the beginning of the war and were often lobbed in with the Australian Army Nursing Service because they were female, but later they officially became members of the Australian Army Women's Medical Service. A lieutenant nursing sister was paid 11 shillings per week. A captain was 16 shillings and a major was paid 18 shillings per week. And they got extra if they had served overseas. Prior to 1943, their uniform and necessary equipment were procured by the individual and then reimbursed. Also prior to 1943, nursing sisters did not hold military rank, but were entitled to the courtesies extended to an officer, including first-class accommodation when travelling within Australia. Nursing sisters weren't addressed by their military rank or by the term ma'am or madam, but by the time-honoured rank of matron or sister. Military terms were only used in official documents. This was because of the tradition attached to the terms of matron and sister, but the more practical reason was for the psychological welfare of the troops they cared for. During their posting to Rocky Creek, the nurses and female staff were treated to chaperone social outings at the races, morning teas, luncheons, dances, weddings, annual shows and fetes. Ladies' groups on the tablelands, such as the Country Women's Association, the Red Cross and the Masonic Order of the Eastern Star, provided entertainment which included trips to Lake Eacham and Tinaroo, along with books to borrow and craft activities. In the words of nursing orderly Avis Hall, who worked here at the Rocky Creek Hospital, I quote, "These two hospitals were both large. They each had 3,000 patients and they admitted on alternate days. I had officers' wards once a month, but the rest of the time I was in the medical wards and we had 60 men in each ward to look after with the sister. I was lucky because I had mostly walking patients, but it was interesting work. But we did have some experimental work carried here. Very hush-hush. I think you know. Weil's disease and different tropical diseases were coming in, and without much knowledge of them, they had these hush-hush wards, you know, where they were trying to find the right treatment for them. They did really good work. The nurses that worked on those wards were sworn to secrecy, so you didn't know much about it until later on. I guess they really furthered medicine to the great extent by what they were doing." End quote. The hush-hush patients also included the 9 Italian POWs who worked on the nearby maize farms between July and September 1945 and attended the 47th Australian Camp Hospital. The Rocky Creek Hospital had visits from distinguished women and sometimes their husbands, including the Commander-in-Chief, Allied Land Forces, Southwest Pacific Area, General Sir Thomas Blamey and Lady Blamey, Dr. Edith Summerskill, member of the British House of Commons and the Empire Parliamentary Delegation, Lady Wakehurst, who was wife of the Governor of New South Wales and the Red Cross Commander, and His Royal Highness, the Duke of Gloucestershire, who was the Governor-General of Australia. Here at Rocky Creek, conditions were unlike the concrete hospitals and quarters the girls were used to. Originally, both the second, and the second sixth hospitals housed 1,200 patients each, consisting of 40 wards, offices, stores and other auxiliary buildings. Most wards were canvas tents, measuring 18.3 metres by 6 metres, with earth floors that were watered daily to make them firm, and a rattan carpet running down the centre aisle. These wards were freezing in winter and hot in summer, and other rooms were constructed from timber and iron. Later, the wards were set on concrete slabs, some of which still remain today, and housed 50 patients. The number 1 Australian Convalescent Depot had 1,000 beds. Patients arrived from Cairns, from New Guinea, and were transported to Rocky Creek by the 4th Australian Hospital ambulance train, which ran 3 times a week. The nurse-patient ratio was roughly 1 nursing sister to 95 patients, with up to 4,000 patients in the whole area. Casualty numbers increased, and by 1944 in March, both hospitals were transferred from tents to sturdy hut hospitals, and the bed capacity of both hospitals had increased by 200 beds each to 1,400 beds. By September 1944, the daily bed average had increased to 1,760 beds. The building still had canvas walls, but the floors were concrete, and each ward now had its own amenities, including a wood stove, kerosene heater, permanent toilet, and an office and a dressing room. And in October 1944, they saw the mains electricity supply finally being connected after being originally generator supplied. The staged closure of Rocky Creek Hospital Complex began in 1944 and continued through to 1945. After Rocky Creek closed, the job didn't stop there for the nurses, as many were transferred overseas to assist with the prisoners of war coming out of Singapore, the Pacific Islands and Japan, and accompanying our men returning home. Most continued nursing after the war, fighting this internal battle with bureaucracy for increased wages, improved conditions, and being able to put into practice the new techniques they'd learned in the military hospitals. Others found their soldier sweethearts and married them. Some never returned to nursing, having dealt with so much horror and pain in such a short time. Today, we call it post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. Then it was battle fatigue, shell shock, soldier's heart, and other such terms. If you asked a wounded serviceman what his hospital stays were, it was the cup of tea from the salvos or the Red Cross lady. He always remembered the compassion and the kindness of the nurses. He knew he was in good hands no matter how much pain he was in. He was out of the war zone and he was safe. If he was blind and he heard a female voice, it gave him comfort. He knew he wasn't alone. To the wounded and dying, they were angels in a nursing uniform. Today we remember and we say thank you to the nurses and auxiliary staff for their courage, sacrifice and compassion to all who passed through the gates of the Rocky Creek Hospital, lest we forget.
Thank you, Margaret, for sharing your research about the important role the nurses played in the Second World War and for making the effort for being in dress of the times. Please welcome Lieutenant Colonel Mick O'Sullivan, Commanding Officer 51st Battalion, Far North Queensland Regiment.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, before I start today, I just want to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the land on which we are today, their elders past, present and emerging. And to the Yudenji people, I say Bulligurin, Bulligurin, which is, as I understand it, based upon my language coach, Private Jai Joseph, is hello and welcome. I'd like to thank Margaret for her speech before me. What she reminded me of is some personal experience of Army nursing. My mother was an Army nurse in a different generation to Rocky Creek, and her experience, I think, was quite similar to that described by Margaret just before me. Her experience was also quite noteworthy in that she was the first married woman in the Australian Army. In that era, as I would imagine it would have been in the era we're speaking about today of Rocky Creek, married women were not permitted to continue to serve in the Army. Sister Hadley met Second Lieutenant O'Sullivan when Second Lieutenant O'Sullivan was searching for a lost wallet for one of his soldiers at the local military hospital, fell in love and got married. But unfortunately, or fortunately for them, she was permitted, because my father was on the way to Vietnam, that she was allowed to stay in the Army until the day before my father returned from Vietnam. Thankfully, we've come a long way in the way that we treat men and women in the Australian Army, as otherwise I don't know where we would be. Today, we mark the 75th year since the end of the Second World War, and also known each year, this day is Victory in the Pacific Day. Some 1 million Australians served in the Second World War, 39,000 of whom lost their lives. 30,000 were taken as prisoners of war. And at this point, I just want to acknowledge the serving men and women of the Australian Defence Force who are here with us today, and those veterans, particularly of the Second World War, who are with us here today. Remarkably, there are still 12,000 veterans of the Second World War alive today, and this may be one of the last opportunities for us to pay our respects to them for their service and dedication from a remarkable generation. This was a war like no other in history, with Australians fighting in theatres of war across the globe: Europe, North Africa, the Mediterranean, Middle East, Asia, and important to the conversation today, the Pacific. It was also the first time that conflict came to the shores of Australia. Today, we remember the nation's commitment to service, but also importantly, the role that Rocky Creek played and that those who served here played. As Japanese aggression moved across the Pacific in the early 1940s, a military presence in North Queensland was gradually increased. The Australian Army first began investing resources in North Queensland in the late 1930s, and when war was declared on Japan on the 9th of December 1941, the construction of military installations in the far north began immediately. The bombing of Darwin in March 1942 and the arrival of American troops in the north in March 1941, as well as the bombing of Townsville in 1942, added further impotence to the establishment of facilities in far north Queensland. When hostilities extended to Papua New Guinea in May of 1942, the military presence in the far north increased even further. The Tablelands was chosen as a site of a major concentration of troops and stores during 1943 for a number of reasons. It was close to New Guinea, where we were fighting a significant campaign, near the port of Cairns, so as that we could be logistically resupplied and able to get into New Guinea, had a cool climate, as we are all beneficiaries of at the moment, but still had suitable jungle training facilities and was mostly malaria-free, so as that those who were hospitalised could recover without the threat of malaria and other tropical diseases. The physically exhausting terrain and climate of New Guinea meant that Australian troops had to be regularly rested and rehabilitated, and the tablelands was absolutely perfect for that, and was also close to the theatre of operations. The Rocky Creek Hospital treated casualties from the New Guinea campaign. As we've heard, operated from October 1942 until September 45, and some 30,000 patients were treated here. The hospital provided vital life-saving treatment for Australians, our allies, sailors, soldiers, airmen and airwomen, and the support they provided was absolutely amazing. And this memorial is completely fitting for that dedicated service of the men and women who ran Rocky Creek. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lieutenant Colonel Mick O'Sullivan. I would now like to welcome John Edward Duffy, or known to many as Jack. Jack is a World War II veteran who served as a deckhand seaman in the Merchant Navy.
Good morning, and thanks for giving us the time to briefly talk today. For those who do not know me, my name is John Duffy, and those who do know me as Jack. I'm 93 years young and fourth generation living on the tableland. During World War II, I was a seaman on the salvage and rescue ship providing support for the Coast Guard and the special force known as the Z Force. Upon leaving school at the age of 13, I began working at the Tolga Post Office, which was at the same time as Rocky Creek Hospital was being built. There is a substantial history in my family regarding the services in the armed forces. My father was a light horseman during the campaign in World War I, and he also was a sergeant in a garrison base at Cooktown during the war too, and the Cairns evacuation. My brother Jim served in the artillery in New Guinea. Both Jim and my father required hospitalisation here at Rocky Creek at different times. My son, Captain Ian Duffy, spent time in the Air Force and flew helicopters and rescued lodges in the Middle East. My grandson, Jack, has been attracted in the Air Force and is waiting for his call-up. My great-grandson, Ben Rees, has recently joined the Army after 5 years with the local cadets. He has participated in numerous events like these being held today. When I recall the war, I think back of a certain woman that went unrecognised. She was my boss at the Tolga Post Office, Carrie Murphy. At the tender age of 19, went beyond her duty by personally delivering the tragic news of the soldiers to the families of the death and the injuries of our brave soldiers. Her empathy will always remind me of the tragedies and the sacrifices made during the war. It is with pride that I am here today to acknowledge the memorial that has been created to respectfully honour the past and allow for the reflection of the future, lest we forget.
Thank you, Jack. We now move on to a very special part of the ceremony to acknowledge the significance of the 75th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. The Department of Veterans Affairs have produced a commemorative medallion and certificate of commemoration for every living veteran of the Second World War. I call upon Senator Susan McDonald to make the presentations on behalf of the Honourable Darren Chester MP, Minister for Veterans Affairs.
Good morning. While Australia can never repay the debt we owe almost 1 million Australians who served, this medallion and certificate are a small but meaningful way we can thank living veterans of the largest global conflict of the 20th century. I am always amazed by the patriotism shown by smaller communities, whether it be young men and women signing up to serve or by the terrific symbols of remembrance these towns have built, including this memorial here at Rocky Creek and the Avenue of Honour just down the road at Yungaburra. When we read the names of those who didn't make it back, we should feel driven to tell all generations about what happened and who those brave people were. Sadly, the end of combat in World War II didn't signal the end of the battles for many veterans that they fought when they got home, and that makes modern day ceremonies such as this all the more important. The medals being awarded today feature the Commonwealth coat of arms, wording of appreciation, and they name the theatres of war that saw the significant involvement of Australian armed forces. It also utilises the poppy as the central symbol, surrounded by the wording of Australia Remembers and the beginning and end years of the Second World War. Can the following gentlemen please come up to the stage as your name is called, and I would ask that we all hold our applause until the end. John Edward Duffy. Philip William English. Frank Webster McGee. And John Stanton Davis Mellick. Please give a round of applause to acknowledge the contribution these men played in keeping Australia safe.
For those who are able, please stand for the marching on the catafalque party from HMAS Cairns.
Centuries, outwards, turn. Centuries, left and arm, and burn.
We now move on to the placing of the wreaths. As your name or organisation is called, please come forward and place your wreath along the wall. Mayor Rod Marty from the Tablelands Regional Council. Commander Glenn Williams, Commanding Officer HMAS Cairns. Lieutenant Colonel Mick O'Sullivan, Commanding Officer 51st Battalion, FNQ Regiment. President Phil Berto Batuch, TPI Centre Cairns. Stan Carswell, MBE, Papua New Guinea Volunteer Rifles. Nev O'Brien, National Service and Combined Forces Association of Australia Incorporated. Ray Burns, National Servicemen's Association, Tablelands Branch. President Desmond Scanlon, Ravenshoe RSL Sub-Branch. Commander Christine Reganzani, OAM, Royal Australian Navy, for the Malanda RSL Sub-Branch. President Ross Kazabo, Mariba RSL Sub-Branch. President Peter Hayton, Cairns RSL Sub-Branch. Mel Lowe, Innisfail RSL Sub-Branch. The Honourable Senator Susan McDonald and Policy Advisor, Senator for Queensland. The Honourable Curtis Pitt MP, Member for Mulgrave and representing Miss Jennifer Howard, MP, Assistant Minister for Veterans Affairs and Assistant Minister for the State. Mayor Angela Toppin, Mariba Shire Council. Mayor Mark Nolan and Councillor Jeff Baines, Kasserine Coast Regional Council. Acting Inspector Greg Giles, Tablelands Patrol Group, Far North District, and Senior Sergeant Officer in charge Kyle Palmer, Queensland Police Service. Principal Ricky Baraxasopolulo, I apologise for that, Walkerman State School. Duncan Ray, Sergeant Owen Llewellyn Davies Griffith. Mark and Sandra Haig in memory of Private Roy Robinson. Val Vivas, RAF Association Admin Brisbane and Cairns Branch. If there's anyone I've missed out or anyone would like to lay a wreath, please do so now. I'd like to introduce you to Councillor Bernie Wilkes to read the Ode of Remembrance. You will find the words to the ode in the program. For those who are able, please continue to stand.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will now observe a minute of silence. Bugler, sound the rouse. Please remain standing and welcome Helen Snelling, accompanied by the Table End Brass Band, to perform the Australian National Anthem. You're all welcome to join Helen.
Australians, all let us rejoice, for we are young and free. With gold and soil and wealth we toil, our home is girt by sea. Our land abounds in nature's gifts of beauty rich and rare. In history's page let every stage advance Australia fair. In joyful strains then let us sing, advance Australia fair. Beneath our radiant Southern Cross we'll toil with hearts and hands to make this Commonwealth of ours renowned of all the lands. For those who come across the seas, we've boundless plains to share. With courage let us all combine to advance Australia fair. In joyful strains then let us sing, advance Australia fair.
Thank you, Helen, and the Table Lands Brass Band. Please now remain standing for the dismounting of the catafalque party. We now move on to the unveiling and dedication of the 2 unit plaques. Can I invite Sharon Linwood, OAM, to conduct the dedications. I also call upon Bob Barkworth and Joe Tomarini to unveil the Reserved Occupation Unit plaque.
75 years ago came victory in the Pacific. We cannot begin to know the feelings experienced back then at the realisation that at last, after 5 long years of suffering and sacrifice, the world would be free of the scourge of war. Today we gather to remember that time and to pay homage and give thanks to those who played their crucial part in the victory we now commemorate. In particular, today we come to recognise the role of the reserved occupations and the Australian Women's Land Army. I call on Bob Barkworth and Joe Tomarini to unveil the Reserved Occupation Unit plaque.
We unveil this plaque today to remember and honour the reserve occupation citizens for their war efforts to keep the home fires burning, who worked the fields to feed our troops, who worked the mines to supply the ammunitions and weaponry. The battlefront was in the hands of the reserve occupation workers to maintain our country and supplies. to help our armed forces to protect and save this country, their families, and their way of life. A good home front is very important to the morale and welfare of our fighting forces, to give hope for the future, and trust this plaque will help our future generations to remember the efforts of the unselfish love and hope these people gave. No country will survive without loyal citizens and a commitment to work for its future, lest we forget.
Lord, we pray a blessing on the memory of those who were in the reserved occupations, doing their bit to meet the demands of the war effort, and so doing support our men and women of the armed forces. In dedicating this plaque, may we always remember and honour the part they played in serving this country and the future of this nation, lest we forget.
I now invite Phyllis Smith, who is here today on behalf of her late sister Dorothy, who served with the Australian Women's Land Army, and Mrs. Edna Beasley, who volunteered with the Women's Emergency Signalling Corps at the Mariba Airport to do the honours of unveiling the plaque for the Australian Women's Land Army. This plaque was sponsored by the Department of Veterans Affairs, saluting their service commemorative grant as an initiative of the National Servicemen's Association Queensland Tableland branch.
Thank you so much for giving me this honour of unveiling this plaque. Our sister Dorothy Harris was a member of the Australian Women's Land Army, and she thoroughly enjoyed the life, and of course tractors were only fairly new those times too. She was lovely. She was happy to drive a tractor and plant potatoes and pick apples and all that sort of thing, because it was in Tasmania. I think she probably joined. She put her age up so she could join the Land Army. I think she wanted to get away from Mum. Thank you very much, everyone. I feel a great
Lord, in dedicating this plaque to the Australian Women's Land Army, we're reminded of the considerable contribution of the young women of Australia who stepped out of their comfort zones to carry out the back-breaking work required to keep this nation going, while those who normally carried out these jobs were away fighting the war. We thank them and we honour them, and we ask for a special blessing to be upon them for the part they played towards our final victory, lest we forget. It'll stay. I think this goes over with the
May I ask if Councillor Clifton would come to the podium to have a brief discussion about Teddy Sheehan.
Thanks, Dave. During the week, most of you would have noticed that Seaman Teddy Sheehan of the HMAS Armidale, some 70 or 75 years after he gave his life by strapping himself to an Oerlikon machine gun and shooting down 2 Japanese aircraft to save his comrades while the ship went down with him. His machine gun was seen firing under the water. It's taken us all of this time, and it's a single reminder that the memory of wars and the efforts that men make and women make should never be forgotten. The other important thing about Teddy Sheehan's award of the Victoria Cross is that he is the first naval winner in Australia's military history of the Victoria Cross. So in memory of Teddy Sheehan, 75 years on, I'd like you to stand if you can, and I'd like to do what would have happened amongst his men if they had survived that long. They would have given him 3 rousing cheers. To Teddy Sheehan, hip hip hooray! Hip hip hooray! Hip hip hooray! Lest we forget.
Thank you, Councillor Clifton. Please seat. Now, can I ask that you move your attention to the memorial wall over the corner, where we will now dedicate the individual service personnel plaques. For those family members dedicating plaques today, please make your way to the memorial wall. Can all other guests please remain seated? I now ask Commander Christine Ragazzani, OAM, Royal Australian Navy, to acknowledge those being recognised today.
Private Leslie Edward Davies Griffith, 31st 51st Australian Infantry Battalion, Australian AIF, QX 44576.
So the family members for that plaque, if you want to come forward. And place a copy on the plaque. If you want to get quick photos.
Lance Sergeant Owen Llewellyn Davies Griffith, 31st 51st Australian Infantry Battalion, AIF, QX 33557. Private William John Flynn, 2nd 11th Australian Commando Squadron, VX 141368. Zappa Michael Pine, 2nd First Australian Mechanical Equipment Company, QX 50201. Signalman Henry Alfred Tranter, 26th Australian Infantry Brigade, Signal Section, Rats of Trebrook, QX 7764.
We gather here today to dedicate these memorial plaques, to honour those whose names they bear, to remember these people who in those critical days of war stepped up to the plate so that the light of humanity and freedom might continue to shine in our world. We come too in grateful thanks for the peace we now enjoy through their efforts, and we pledge ourselves to the responsibility of continuing their legacy so willingly given, lest we forget.
So that concludes the 75th anniversary of the victory in the Pacific. Tablelands Regional Council and the Rocky Creek War Memorial Park Advisory Committee would like to thank all that have attended today's service and given their time to ensure a memorable day. Thank you to the HMAS Cairns, the Salvation Army, Atherton SES, Tablelands Brass Band, Tableland Pipe Band, Mark Langtree, Sharon Linwood OAM, Rocky Creek War Memorial Park Advisory Committee, our guest speakers and World War II veterans. I would also like to provide a big thank you for making today's event happen. Please give a round of applause to Tablelands Regional Council staff Jodie Coco, Gwyneth Navard and Nadine Hill. All have volunteered and worked hard to get this happening. We hope to see you again next year for the 76th anniversary of the victory in the Pacific on the Sunday, 15th of August 2021. Please return home safely. Thank you.